Welcome to the Mixtape with Scott, a podcast that breathes life into the oral history of economics over the last half century. Here we delve into my personal areas of interest, like the influential work of Gary Becker's students, the fascinating realm of causal inference, and the burgeoning demand for PhD economists in the tech industry. But above all, we explore these changes and pivotal periods through the personal journeys of economists. They guide us from their childhood to the present, sharing the biographies of their work and sometimes even the sociological origins of those works. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Cunningham. This week, I had the absolute pleasure of interviewing Dr. Steve Pischke, a standout figure in contemporary labor economics. Steve's educational journey took him to Princeton Industrial Relations during the late 80s, that transformative era, as longtime listeners now know, where the blossoming of the credibility revolution under the stewardship of giants like Orley Ashenfelter, David Card, Alan Kruger, classmate Josh Angrist occurred. Both upon graduating, Steve developed into a distinguished labor economist with a broad spectrum of research interests that has spanned several decades. But in addition to his many publications, he's also the author of a trailblazing book, Mostly Harmless Econometrics, a bestseller that has enlightened and inspired an entire generation. It, in fact, inspired me to write my own book. Our conversation takes us onto a wonderful journey through Steve's life, from his childhood to his initial foray into journalism and then into economics as both a student and a budding labor economist. It's an enlightening deep dive that reveals the person behind the economist, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. Also, check out my Substack, Scott Substack, where I similarly regularly post what I call explainers about econometrics. Thanks very much. Well, today is a real honor to have on the podcast a person who's many people listening know by name, Dr. Steve Pischke. Dr. Pischke, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thanks very much for having me, Scott. It's my pleasure.
Can you tell us your full name and if I know I've just mispronounced it, so your full name, your job title, and the name of the firm that pays your paycheck?
Well, my full name is Jon Steffen Pischke. You pronounced it very well. I go by Steve among economists, and I'm a professor of economics at the London School of Economics.
Oh, great. Okay. All right. Before we get started, I'll open with an icebreaker. So what's a book that you have read or a movie that you've watched recently or ever that left a lasting impression on you, and why?
Whew. I'm into history, and a little while ago I read Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, and that I did find quite influential. I didn't agree with what it says in the end, setting out to sort of answer a big question, sort of why the West developed and not other parts of the world. I think in the end, the answer he gives is probably not that satisfying, because it's so much focused on the origins, and he's an evolutionary biologist, and it's sort of an economic history question. So as an economist, you also feel there might be things where it might be good to have some more knowledge, but it's a very well written book, and he uses narratives very well, and I didn't know a whole lot about early prehistory, and learned quite a bit from that book, so it did touch me.
Yeah, that's funny. That I've always wanted to have a class, and maybe I will do this, have a class where I read that book and then read your co-author Acemoglu and Robinson's book alongside of it. I always wondered if those two would be in conversation with each other at all. I haven't thought about that book in a long time. It was so big about 10 years ago or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, so let's get started. So tell me, where did you grow up, and what are some of the memories you have and experiences you had from that time?
I'm from Germany. I grew up in a small town called Ulm in the south of Germany, um, in a middle class family. Um, when I was growing up, I would say I was reading a lot,
Mm,
both fiction and nonfiction. Um, at the time, you'd get books from the library, and I think um, at the library I went to, you could check out three at most at once. And I remember one day going when it opened, getting a book, going home, reading it, and returning it before the library closed so I could get another one out.
mm,
Um,
yeah.
in school, I was taking a lot of math and physics, so was probably more interested sort of in on the science side. But then as a teenager, I also got interested in political, social problems, issues, and I'm generally interested in a lot of things, and like to learn about a lot of things. So I found it very hard to decide what I should do
Mm,
going to university.
mm.
Um,
That's hard in Germany, right? Because you sort of have to have a decision ahead of time.
that's correct. Yeah, you
Huh.
apply to a particular field. Um, so eventually I decided I wanted to become a journalist.
Ah,
Um, and sort of not do some science thing. Also, I sort of considered things in between sciences and social sciences. Yeah, but I decided to become a journalist, and I started studying political science, sociology, and economics. So
yeah.
there's a degree where you could combine um, those. I went to the University of Constance, which is in another small town on the Swiss border, all the way in the south. Um, and after my first term, I switched into just economics.
Mm,
In retrospect, um, I'm not sure I remember exactly why I made that switch. It was certainly not that there was some great teaching in the economics courses that I took, or I guess I took one course in my first term. That
mm,
was actually not too bad, but it was sort of a very high level intro overview.
mm.
Um, I actually liked the political science course I took a lot. It was sort of about world systems and development. Yeah, why some countries are poor, why other countries are rich. So something related to the Jared Diamond theme as
Yeah,
well.
right.
Um, so
Something caught your attention though to get you out of journalism.
well, I continued wanting to be a journalist for a while. So in Germany, you can't study journalism at university.
Oh,
You study a subject, and then when you're done, you do an apprenticeship type training with a media organization, newspaper, or broadcast.
yeah,
So that's kind of a standard route. So I was still that was still my thought.
yeah, yeah,
Um, so reflecting on why did I get into economics, I guess it was a combination of feeling sort of political science and sociology. I felt you could read literature and it was
yeah.
fairly accessible, but economics seemed very alien and, you know, you can't just read something and understand it. You
Right,
really need the training.
right.
Um, I guess I must have been somewhat intrigued by the fact that economics actually uses math and mathematical modeling.
Yeah,
And that was something, that touched on my skills, and I always liked math as well. And I probably also was getting somewhat worried that a lot of the students in political science all wanted to be journalists, and whether there'd be enough jobs out there for all of us. So economics seemed, like a potentially more
Safer.
fruitful, safer major. Also, I don't consider myself as somebody who's sort of greatly worried about these things, like what type of job I would get.
Yeah.
But that might have played some role as
Mm.
well.
Mm.
Um,
When you were there, so when you started to switch majors to econ, were you still thinking you might be a journalist then?
yes, yes,
You were
yes.
just thinking this, I'll not do the political. So how did you think if you were going to still be a journalist, what was it about the econ that you thought would make it more interesting or better?
Well, I mean, you can you can report on economic issues, of
I see.
course, but also I thought it would give me equally some grounding in an academic field, and then you learn the journalism part. As I said, anyway, you have to do that with a news organization.
Right.
Uh, yeah, but I spent 2 years in Constance, and I kept dabbling sort of in other things as well. I took a history course, I took an English course,
Mm.
and so forth. And
Mm-hmm.
did sort of outside things and didn't necessarily concentrate all that much on all my courses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Now, what
so
year is
then,
this? What year is this, Steve?
yeah,
What year are you talking about?
this is in the early 1980s. I
Early
started
80s.
studying in 1981.
Got it.
Um, so then I really wanted to go abroad for a year. Um, and I applied sort of to various exchange schemes.
Mm.
Sort of the top one is Fulbright, a Fulbright scholarship, but I didn't get that. It's quite competitive. Then my university had an exchange program with Rutgers, and I didn't get into that either. My
Mm.
grades weren't good enough.
Mm.
So my department ran an exchange with a small college in Pennsylvania called Susquehanna University.
Mm.
And three of us applied for that, and they took 3 students. So I got into that one.
Mm-hmm.
So I went for a year to Susquehanna University. It's about an hour north of Harrisburg, on the Susquehanna River.
Mm.
Um,
Was it beautiful?
it's beautiful, remote. It's in a
Yeah.
small village. It's a college with 1,700 students, very different from a German university that was crowded at the time, because I'm sort of in the middle of the German baby boom.
Ah.
Um,
Was it the
so
Amish? Is it the Amish country?
not exactly.
Okay.
It's sort of a regular regional liberal arts college.
Mm-hmm.
So at Susquehanna, I didn't have to do anything specific, and I just took a wide variety of courses, including a journalism course, a course in broadcasting, and I worked at the radio station reading the news in my horrible German accent at the time. But it was cool that you get to do stuff like that at American universities.
Yeah.
And there's less prescribed. It was a very different atmosphere as well. I mean, all the classes were at most 15, 20 people,
Mm.
no large lectures or so. So I actually enjoyed the atmosphere. And so I considered, why not just stay in the US and finish my studies there,
Mm.
rather than going back to Germany. I mean, my university for German standards wasn't particularly big, but for its size, it did feel kind of crowded at times, and yeah, much less personal and so forth. But it was sort of late in the academic year already when I thought about this, and I didn't know anything about the U.S. academic system. The German universities are all kind of equal. It doesn't matter a lot where you study, particularly as an undergrad. So, I had no real clue about the differences in the US between, Harvard and, community colleges and
Right.
all the stuff that's out there.
Yeah.
So I was living sort of in a small house called the International House at Susquehanna University, together with the other German visiting students and then some students from there who were going to go to our university the next year. And there was a faculty couple living in the house. And the woman was an English professor. She got her PhD from the State University of New York at Binghamton. So I knew about Binghamton from her. And so I looked at their economics program, and they offered a master's and, of course, undergrad and PhD. So I applied. I actually ended up applying to their PhD program. I didn't have an undergrad degree at the time, but in Germany, we go to school for 13 years instead of 12. And then I studied for 2 years in Germany and 1 year at Susquehanna.
You had 4 years.
So I argued if you add it up, you get to 16.
You get 16.
So yeah, I was thinking, well, I could get the master's at Binghamton. I was still thinking of becoming a journalist eventually. But I realized if you apply for the master's, you have to pay for it. If you apply for the PhD, they give you a scholarship.
Right.
But you can get a master's after the first 2 years of the PhD. So that seemed to me the better deal.
Yeah, right.
So I applied to the PhD and I got in. They were happy with my education adding up to 16 years.
Yeah, right. They did a college dummy based on years of school.
Yeah. So, it's not a very selective PhD program. But so I ended up going to SUNY, and I spent 2 years there, and that was actually great for me. It did two things for me. One is I never really had good friends at school or at university, but at Binghamton, there were other people who were perfectly happy to work on homeworks till 11 at night. And, that was sort of, we considered that having a good time. And, you chat and you can have a good time. So I had friends there, I felt, and that was different from the places where I was before because I'm just a nerd.
Right.
And, I'm kind of shy, didn't sort of make contacts easily. So that was good. And the second thing is that I really learned economics there. The teaching in Germany wasn't very good. We learned things like how to prove the Slutsky equation, but I didn't have a conception of what an income and substitution effect is.
Yep.
And, at Binghamton in the PhD program, that's where I saw the diagram that goes with that.
Yeah.
Where you draw the shift in the budget constraint and you see what's going on.
Yep.
Okay, now that makes sense. And, then, you go through the proof of the Slutsky equation again. So that was actually good. And the teaching at Binghamton was good. I had a number of good teachers there. So that was also quite enjoyable. But I had a friend from Taiwan, and sometime during our first year he said, Steve, we need to get out of here. It's really not a good enough place. And so he applied to other universities and left after the first year. He went to Washington University in St. Louis. I stayed for another year. But at Binghamton, I'm studying economics at the graduate level. I sort of started to understand, what the important departments are and where the people are that are writing the papers that are on the reading lists and so forth. So I also applied to various places in my second year. And I ended up going to Princeton.
In your second year, you applied to Princeton.
You did it? Yeah.
So okay, so did you apply everywhere, or was it that you were drawn to something in particular at Princeton? What year would that have been?
So I started in Princeton in 1987.
So that's a year after Bob Lalonde's.
Sorry?
That's a year after Bob Lalonde's AER.
Yes.
Were you starting to hear about the things that were going on at Princeton?
No.
Okay.
Even when I was there, I didn't know really what was going on. I was much more interested in macro at the time. In Germany in the 70s and 80s, unemployment was very high, or throughout Europe, unemployment was very high and wasn't coming down.
Yeah.
So that seemed one of the major problems. Actually, from starting in Germany, the macro teaching, I think, was better than the micro teaching, and the macro probably appealed more to me at the time. So I wanted to work on macro and unemployment and so forth.
Yeah.
So after my first year in Binghamton, I took a big trip driving through the US, across the US to California, and then up the coast to Washington and sort of back. And on my way, I stopped at universities and visited their econ departments, tried to find some PhD students and chat with them.
Yeah.
To find out, what might be good places. So I learned about a few departments there. Of the places I applied to and got in, actually Princeton was the only one I hadn't visited. But I had an offer from Harvard, and they were giving me some money, and Princeton hadn't offered me any money. But I'd visited Harvard on a different trip. It's obviously opposite direction from Binghamton in the east rather than in the west, so it wasn't on the summer trip. But I'd gone there too and tried to find some PhD students to talk to, and it was the only place where no PhD students wanted to talk to me. So I'd labeled Harvard as too snobby.
Oh, Harvard didn't want to talk to you.
The PhD students.
The students didn't. Got it. Yeah. Okay.
This was before I was admitted or anything. Yeah. I was just stopping by, sort of, look, I'm interested in doing a PhD. Would you chat with me for a little bit?
Yeah.
And couldn't find anybody like that.
Right.
So I called Princeton, and they offered me whatever Harvard had offered me in terms of a scholarship. So I decided Princeton instead.
Did you meet with Princeton students? Did some students?
I hadn't met with any Princeton students. Okay. I think I talked to some people over the phone, but again, you sort of can see that I was fairly clueless. I wanted to do macro, and Princeton has absolutely no track record in graduating macro students at that time.
Yeah.
But there were people there, Alan Blinder, Ben Bernanke, that seemed like big names in macro. Yeah. So I went to Princeton. But I didn't have a very big scholarship, so I needed more money. And Princeton in your first year gives you an advisor, and Ben Bernanke was my first year advisor. So I went to Ben and asked him, look, I need some RA work over the summer because I need to make some money.
Yeah.
And he said, well, if you need money, you should go to the industrial relations section because that's where they have money.
Right.
So he said, go find a guy called David Card and talk to him. So that was a little bit scary. Trudging over there. The IR section is not in the department, or wasn't in the department at the time. It was in the library, and you had to go down all the way down to the dungeons of the library. And I found David Card and spoke to him. And I don't remember exactly anymore. Probably didn't happen that day, but basically he said, okay, you can have some RA work over the summer working for Alan Kruger, who was a new assistant professor at the time. So that's what I ended up doing. And then I kind of got sucked into the whole labor crowd there.
So coming from macro, what did you, if you had to describe to a macroeconomist back then, like you could have imagined, you know, you've been around these guys at the section for a little while, like maybe a year, and you go back and you're talking to somebody that's a macroeconomist. How would you explain to them what kind of culture and what kind of people they were in the section?
I don't know. I wasn't really talking to macroeconomists. I mean, the other person who was very influential on me and became one of my advisors was Angus Deaton. He taught our first year econometrics course, which I thought was very good. So I wanted to take whatever other courses he taught in second year, one of which was development economics, which I found interesting as well anyway. And then he taught a course that was just, it was sort of an applied methods course, but it was basically things he had worked on. So the first half of the course was the Deaton and Mühlbauer book on consumer behavior. So that's micro household level modeling. And then he was working on the consumption function book stuff he was doing sort of during the mid 80s. And that was the second half of the book. So that was kind of the approaches and puzzles in estimating life cycle consumption models that had popped up at the time and where Deaton was involved. So I was very interested in that because I liked his courses. I liked, you know, Deaton's approach and so forth. But, you know, of course, the macro at the time was very much representative agent, no heterogeneity.
Right.
But I mean, being in the IR section and being exposed to micro data work and what's going on with households, I was actually very aware that, you know, that can be very different from what's going on the macro side. And that sort of nexus ended up becoming my job market paper, which was on consumption. How did I get away from unemployment? It was after my second year. David Card became my main advisor. And I had a chat with him and I told him I wanted to work on unemployment and I was thinking of maybe estimating VARs of, you know, employment flows into and out of unemployment and so forth. And so we had a discussion for a while and the discussion ended with David asking me, well, Steve, why do you think unemployments are too high at the end of the day? And I said, well, because wages are too high. Okay, so what are you going to say that's new? After that, I didn't work on unemployment anymore. So I ended up writing this paper about, what's called the Deaton paradox, which is the fact that if you plug an aggregate level income process into a life cycle model, you get a process for the for consumption out or changes in consumption. And the consumption series turns out to be too smooth in the data compared to what the model predicts, because what's going on in the macro data is if you have a good quarter, most likely the next quarter is going to be good too, and actually any shock initially gets amplified.
What do
So
you
it's
mean?
actually
Any shock gets amplified.
on average, the next quarter is going to be even better. So
Oh,
if you go into a boom, the boom is going to keep going on. If you go into a recession, the recession is going to keep going on average, rather than sort of things turning around.
right.
So the aggregate income data are not just persistent, but more than persistent. Now, I knew from a paper by David Card, About and Card, on labor supply, where they estimated earnings processes, that wasn't true at the individual or household level.
Yeah.
Individual level earnings or incomes are actually less than persistent. They're transitory components. So, if you get unemployed, you're typically not unemployed 2 or 3 quarters later. You get a job after a few months on average. So the individual level data would actually predict a different consumption response from the aggregate data. And that just puzzled me. And I thought, how can the two be reconciled? And it seemed to me like with the microdata, there should be no puzzle in the consumption series. And I wondered about that for a while, but also didn't quite know how to go about it. And I went and talked to Angus Deaton about it, and he listened to me. And then he said, well, if that's right, it would be a great idea, but I think it's wrong. But then the next day, he sent me an email with a little toy model of what I was talking about. But he'd set up the model so, there was an aggregate component to the income process. There was an individual component, but both were random walks. So both have the same persistence. So they weren't capturing what I wanted.
Right.
But then I saw, well, that's the model, and I just need to get the processes right. So at that point, I kind of knew what I had to do. I worked it out. It turns out, as one of my fellow students told me, this is the Lucas Islands model on inflation, where firms, set prices and they see their own customers and what's going on with their demand. They don't see the whole economy.
Yeah.
But then you aggregate up to what's happening in the whole economy. So individual firms or workers can be fooled for a little bit, but they'll eventually catch up. Or, Lucas or Friedman had those ideas on inflation.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I worked that out, and I estimated micro income processes and aggregate consumption processes and put it together. And it actually worked out quite nicely in explaining the data.
This is not going in the direction I was expecting at all, because, as someone who wrote Mostly Harmless Econometrics and having spoken with some of your advisors and classmates, I was expecting you to tell me you wrote a job market paper using some incredible instrumental variables design. This is where in this is where at the section are you beginning to sort of notice all this causal inference stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I was in the middle of all of this, what you're describing. And I certainly didn't notice at the time that there was something going on that was sort of fundamentally new and, it's going to be, I don't know how to describe it, path breaking or
Yeah.
sort of changing empirical practice. And I mean, one reason is that I was a PhD student. I was learning stuff. I had no real sense of the history of where economics was coming from and how it was done.
Right.
So, I listened to whatever my teachers said, and that made sense. And they all seemed very careful researchers and about doing careful research and getting things right. So I thought that was just how things are done.
Right.
And the Deaton work and the About and Card paper I talked about, I mean, they're much more structural. They're not deeply structural, but they're combining models and taking sort of direct insights from the models to data. And that was kind of what I was doing at the time too, by, sort of estimating error components models for income processes.
Yeah.
But, I did see that there was this stuff going on around me and people were interested in credible identification and using diffs and diffs and instrumental variables. So of course I learned about these things.
Yeah.
I don't think at the time I saw a particular tension or so. David Card in particular was doing both, and I don't think he saw a particular tension.
Yeah.
I thought he just, wanted to tackle important problems and get them right.
Right.
And different problems are sort of requiring different methods. So yeah, that's kind of how I felt. Now, when I was at Princeton, I never knew about the Lalonde paper. I never knew about the Aschenfelter training papers. I mentioned before that I'm interested in a lot of things.
Yeah.
So, particularly in my second year at Princeton, I think I took a lot of different courses that weren't really required. I took a history of economic thought course that clashed with the labor lecture, so only went to half the labor lectures. And I don't know whether Orly ever talked about the training program stuff. He taught labor supply. And I mean, at the time when I was a PhD student, Orly was kind of withdrawing and not that active. He was editing the AER, and that took a lot of his time. And he was very much into his wine economics that was new at the time. So he was around sometime, but he wasn't as engaged. So yeah, I didn't get it from Orly. David Card taught some labor demand stuff that was fairly structural. Bob Pins was visiting the year when I was there and taught part of the labor, and he taught sort of some labor theory, which, was very helpful to learn, I thought. And so Alan Kruger was the one, who was talking about program evaluation type things. For example, he talked about the Solon unemployment insurance work. was part of Gary Solon's Princeton PhD, but my understanding is Gary pretty much did that on his own, sort of trying to find good methods, to get around the fact that benefits tend to be correlated with worker characteristics, and you need to isolate changes in benefits that just come from the rules rather than from individual circumstances. If you want to figure out what the effect of the benefit rules are.
Yeah.
So he was one of the first sort of to applying different type methods using state level changes in laws to these problems. And that was something we learned. Bruce Meyer was visiting for a year while I was a PhD student, also working on unemployment insurance and writing papers in that style. So yeah, I mean, I got exposed to some of that. And then, of course, I saw David was writing about the Mariel boat lift. David and Alan Kruger were writing about the minimum wage. The engrossed and Kruger compulsory schooling paper was sort of a prominent piece that was coming out at the time. Yeah, but again, I thought of these just as good research.
Right.
Really.
Right. So, moving into your that period of time when you're doing your early research, I wanted to talk a little bit now to kind of pivot a little bit. I wanted to talk a little bit about your work on training on that was with Dr. Acemoglu. Before I get into it, though, what's the origin of that relationship with Daron Acemoglu? Did you know him at LSE? Is that where you guys knew each other?
No. So again, I remained fairly clueless even when I finished my PhD. So I decided to go back to Germany, and I worked in Germany for 2 years. And that wasn't a good experience because Germany, by the late 80s, early 90s, was still kind of a backwater. German economics hadn't been very integrated with what's going on in the international community. It was unusual for people to go abroad and so forth. And I worked at a research institute, and I really didn't particularly like the job. It was sort of, you were supposed to raise money. It wasn't sort of just academic. So, I decided after a little while to go back on the job market, and I got a job at MIT. So I moved to MIT the same year as Daron, and we had offices next to each other. But while I was in Germany, and I always seem to happen to stumble sort of upon interesting things in my career more than seeking them out. But one of my colleagues I was working with had invited Tom Kane, who's an education economist. And Tom was very interested in the German apprenticeship system.
Yeah.
So I was chatting with him about that, and he was using the visit to go around to firms and talk to them about apprenticeships. And because I was a labor economist, more than a macroeconomist by that time, I went along, and stuff seemed interesting. I didn't really know that much about the German apprenticeship system, but it was sort of intriguing. And the main intriguing point was, the firms pay apprentices in order to get trained. So that was very much going against the grain of the Becker model, we have that workers should be the one who pay for their own training if the training is valuable in different firms. Now, the apprenticeship is very regulated, and the apprentices do exams at the end and their curricula and so forth. So the skills are meant to be general and portable to other employers. That's part of the whole point.
Yeah.
So that seemed to present a puzzle. In big firms in Germany, for the first year, the apprentices would just spend all their time in a training workshop and not produce anything, yet the firm pays them something.
Right.
So there was this puzzle that didn't fit with Becker. So I got interested in that, and when I was at MIT, I started talking to Duran about that. And Duran was interested in sort of two-sided investment problems and matching and so forth. And that started writing about that. And I had the hunch that it must somehow be some adverse selection problem, that the firms learn something about the apprentices. At the end of the apprenticeship in Germany, the contract ends. So the apprentices have no right to stay at the firm. The firm can let them go. But in practice, of course, the firms will hire most of the apprentices into permanent jobs. But of course, some of them, they decide, the bigger firms the sort of, actually not necessarily the bigger ones, all firms, but particularly the smaller ones, actually let a lot of their apprentices go. So I thought, well, that certainly won't be random. Those will be the workers they like the least.
Right.
So maybe that's the explanation. So yeah, Duran and I were talking about those issues, and it took us a while. Duran always works on a lot of stuff and a lot of different topics at the same time. So I think it was mostly getting him sort of to the point where he would give these ideas enough thought. But then once he gets into something, he's, really very dynamic and gets things done very quickly. So yeah, we ended up writing a bunch of papers building on these ideas. So the first paper took this adverse selection idea and we worked that out, and we came up with an empirical test using the fact that in Germany, men do military service, compulsory military service, or used to at the time. And, whether you do your military service exactly after the apprenticeship, that happens for some, but not everybody. So if that's reasonably random, then the people who have to separate from their firm to do military service and then don't go back, those separations are probably less self-selected than the workers that are being kicked out by the firms because they're lemons. So we exploited that idea. And then,
is it exactly, Steve, how is it exactly different from Becker? I'm not sure I followed completely. What is Becker say? What empirical regularity is Becker saying shouldn't be happening?
So Becker is saying, if the training the firm gives you, if that's useful at other firms as well, so other firms would be willing to pay you for your skills, then the workers should be financing their own training. And that doesn't have to mean that the workers give money to the firm that trains them, but that might happen just through wages being lower than what they otherwise would be, because most workers, while they get trained, they do something productive for the firm as well. So it's not necessarily easy to see this from the data.
Yeah.
Who pays? But for the German apprenticeship system, that seemed fairly clear that the firms were financing some of the training up front. And there's some other examples that are pretty stark as well. So, training where the firms really paying for it did seem to go on in markets. And we wanted to come up with an explanation. Well, what has to be different from the Becker setup where the labor market is competitive for that to come about? And, you need some market imperfection that the firms get some rents from the employment relationship. So if they finance the training up front, they can recoup those investments later. And need an incentive to do that. So the rents, the difference between wages and the workers' productivity actually has to be going up in their skill levels.
Is the fact that the firm is paying for their human capital accumulation even evidence for labor market imperfections?
Well, according to what we say, yeah.
That's what I mean. In your model,
it has to be labor market imperfections. That's part of the explanation.
And they're doing it because they can sort of scrape back on the back end.
Yes. And, if the rents they earn from the skilled workers are higher, then they have an incentive to actually training the workers and making them more skilled.
This is kind of crazy. So I'm not I could be completely off base, but I was just like, as you were talking, because earlier you said, when you were looking at graduate schools, you were looking at the master's programs and you were going to have to pay for the master's programs, but then in the PhD programs, they paid for you. And then I just started thinking, you could argue, the graduate school is where you're getting skills and you're getting apprenticed, and you got apprenticed by Angus Deaton and David Card. And you could argue that graduate schools are extremely monopsonistic in the sense that it's very difficult to leave a program to go to another one. I mean, you did it, but you have to go to a different city and you have to start over. And so there's all these frictions. So I was just kind of wondering, is your model with Dr. Acemoglu, is it general enough that you would even say, well, there's elements of this even in our main way that workers get skill, graduate PhD programs and things like that? Do you think that there's anything to that?
Well, that's a very interesting thought. I never thought about that. I think the PhD students are part of the university's production function. They do contribute to what universities do. They do relatively cheap teaching in particular.
Right.
Because we get the PhD students to do all the things that we as professors don't find as pleasant, like doing a lot of grading. And
that's right.
like that. So that's probably why it's worth paying them.
Right.
But maybe the PhD is a little bit different. I'm thinking on the research side, I guess there's some of that too. RA work, again, we get the PhD students to do the stuff that's more mundane and boring.
Yeah.
Right. But if you have good PhD students, they are also contributors and collaborators, and it's sort of fun having them around and having them be part of the research process.
Yeah. So it's a little different. It's not, it doesn't, it's got some topical features but it's not really the same kind of phenomenon.
Yeah. Actually, sort of thinking about European countries, in many European countries, doctoral students will be real employees of the university. So, primarily they are there to to do some teaching and grading and so forth.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a part-time job they get paid for, and then they also, work on their dissertation
Right.
for the rest of the time.
Yeah. You know what chapter of your book is not in your book is something that reminds me of your paper with John DiNardo, where you look at this literature that I think maybe was started by Dr. Kruger, looking at the returns to computer use and on wages, this kind of larger old literature on technology and labor and inequality, which probably with this chat GPT stuff, we might start to see that literature come back alive again. But the way that you and Dr. DiNardo went about it was this sort of this way of, my interpretation of it, this way of challenging that result was what I just kind of call the placebo analysis or the falsification analysis. And it's actually one of those kind of subtle ideas that is very hard to teach a student at the beginning, that like the falsification is actually really, really important for causal inference. But it's interesting. I mean, first I was wondering, when you wrote that is that a correct interpretation of how you and Dr. DiNardo kind of went about that question of looking at pencils as
Yes.
a type of, can you tell me a little bit about that and how that idea came about?
No, absolutely. I think you described it very well. Well, first of all, Alan Kruger's paper on computers and wages. So this is data from the 1980s, basically. Personal computers were just coming around at that time. When I did my PhD, we worked on mainframes. And you had to, go to the computer center to pick up your output and so forth. So it was a different world then, but PCs were coming around, and PCs were percolating in businesses. And so there were some workers who used computers by the early 90s. There were many workers who didn't use any computers, and Alan had that idea of looking how that's associated with wages and what might be going on. So it's a great paper. And Alan picked up that they asked about whether you use a computer on your job on the current population survey, which is the main US labor force survey, so large samples, and data that are around for various for long periods. So how did John DiNardo and I got into the pencils paper? Well, I was at MIT. John was visiting for a year. John had been a PhD student at Princeton as well. He was a couple of years ahead of me and was one of those older PhD students who was a bit of a mentor who I'd go to for questions. And John was always happy to chat and was a very jolly fellow. So when he was visiting MIT, we were talking about the Kruger computers paper. And John said, I bet you if you had a data set where you knew whether people use pocket calculators, those people would have a wage premium too. I said, well, I have a data set that has that. That's in fact the data Doron and I were using for the apprentice analysis. And it's a data set about worker skills and where they get skills from. And so it asks workers about all types of things they may be using on their job and all types of things they may be doing on their job. So it asks, are you using a computer on your job? Are you using, a cash register, desk calculator?
Mhm.
Are you using a hammer? Are you sitting down while you're working? Are you using writing materials like pen and paper?
Yeah.
So, we went to my office and cranked up the data set and looked, and basically all these things have positive wage differentials except for the hammer.
Except for
That's
the
bad.
hammer.
Yeah.
So how did you interpret that?
So,
Because
so
was the idea of using a falsification, is that something that, like, in the longer tradition of labor and economics at that time, that was not an uncommon way to go about it? Like, to challenge a paper, might be to use the falsification approach, or was this really novel what you guys were doing?
I don't know whether it was novel. I mean, that basic idea must have been around for a long time. I mean, the idea behind the Kruger paper is, he wanted to argue that computers were coming around. They are changing what type of workers firms will want to hire. They will want to hire workers that have skills complementary to using computers. Do those workers then get paid higher wages? I think
Sure. Yeah,
that's
it's like a skill bias, golden and cats kind of story.
that's kind of the idea. So, the pencils were attractive in particular because we think that being able to write is a skill that everybody has.
Right.
And our data were from Germany, not the US, but either country. So it shouldn't be a skill that you get paid for, because if everybody has that skill, that sort of it shouldn't be associated with any wage differential.
Yeah.
Right. Whether you write on your job is not
Right.
because you're able to write. It's because some jobs require it, others don't.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it provides a falsification test because it might suggest that it's just different jobs that get higher pay, and the higher paid jobs happen to be ones where you're writing things. They happen to be ones where you might be working with a computer.
Mm-hmm.
But it's picking up something else about the jobs and maybe the
Yeah.
workers that work in these jobs, but it's not the computer per se.
Right. Right. It was selection, or there might be more selection going on than there is causal effects.
Exactly.
Right. Because you're not randomizing those computers.
Yes.
Right. Right. Well, so we're sort of at the top of the hour, and I wanted to kind of close with a question. So if you could go back in time and you could talk to your younger self, what would you tell them about, what's important in life, what's important in having a career? What is it that they should be? What's the best advice you could give that young version of yourself about the years to come?
Huh. So, I mean, looking back at my career, it wasn't all very planned out, but in retrospect, I feel very lucky about all the people I've met and I managed to work with. Alan Kruger, for whom I started as an RA and then became a co-author. And I feel a little bit sad about the pencils paper, that I think John and I didn't communicate with Alan well enough at the beginning. And Alan actually got quite upset about our paper at a point. Yeah, but
What do you wish?
work.
What do you wish if you could do that again? What would you do different?
I think we should have just talked to Alan earlier
Yeah.
about what we're doing, getting his comments. I mean, we were writing about his paper, so that was a fair thing to do.
Right. Right.
I mean, we probably would have written the paper anyway.
Sure.
Alan probably wouldn't have liked it anyway, but still.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Deaton and Cart, were great and very influential on me. Josh Engrossed, of course, was at Princeton at the time. As a PhD student, I didn't know him that well, but he joined MIT a few years after me. And we taught a course together. So he became a big influence on me, and teaching together with Josh, I set into, the part that he taught. And that's, where I really learned all the treatment effects stuff and the history of that. So yeah, I feel very lucky about that. It wasn't planned on my part at all. I happened to come across good opportunities, and I think I hopefully took the right ones when they came around. Pretty happy with what I managed to do and be a participant in. I mean, certainly working with Josh on the books later on was a great part. I think in terms of advice to younger people, do the things that you enjoy and that really interest you. I mean, you'll by now understand that I didn't become a journalist, that at some point, I found that I liked the academic work, sitting in an office and, working till late at night on some thorny problem. And and sometimes, cracking problems, and, paper comes out that then decades later somebody still asks you about.
Well, it's so nice to meet you, Steve. I've been your book in particular had just a transformative effect on my career, and in more ways than I was anticipating. And I learned so much from it, and I still learn so much from it all the time. And just want to thank you for that book. It's neat. You've been such a central figure in the training of a whole generation of quantitative social scientists all over the world. That must be really a rewarding feeling. Or I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think it is true that you've helped train a whole generation.
Yeah, we're certainly very happy that it seems like the books have found an audience, and particularly younger economists like them and get something out of them. So we're happy about that. Yep.
Good. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. It was really nice to hear your story, and just to hear you talking. I was just loved just falling into your story. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott, for interviewing me. It's been my pleasure being on your podcast, and I hope it's interesting to the listeners. Gonna see us through. Honey, you need me. Baby, I need you.